You're listening to KW Magazine, 98.5 CKWR. I'm John Maciel. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. For years, researchers and experts have been on a quest to prove that radiation from cell phones and other electronic devices is unsafe. But although the evidence seems to point to those dangers, most people simply don't want to have anything to do with it. We're pleased to be joined on the line by Dr. Kent Chamberlain. He is a professor and chair emeritus of the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the University of New Hampshire. Doctor, good evening. Thank you so much for sharing some time with us tonight.
Thank you for having me, John.
My pleasure. Let's start with the fact that you were recently a member of a New Hampshire commission that was tasked with looking at the effects of radiation and 5G. Tell us a little bit about the essence of this particular commission, and perhaps in an overall way, tell us what some of the more significant findings were that this commission came up with.
Absolutely. Well, this is a first-in-the-nation commission. We're the first to look at this issue, the issue of radiation from cell phones and 5G. And it was formed through legislation. The way it works in New Hampshire is you have to have a bill. That bill has to get passed by the legislature, and then it's signed by the governor. Now, what's significant about this is that the bill was passed with bipartisan support and signed by the Republican governor. And the reason this is significant is because there tends to be pushback from Republicans and from people who are more business oriented. But the concern about exposure to wireless radiation was enough that the bill passed. And so the commission was formed. And this commission, or what was stated in the bill that brought about the commission, the formation of the commission, specified that we had to have experts from certain fields on the commission. And in the final analysis, we had 13 people with expertise in medicine. There were 2 doctors, epidemiology, toxicology, engineering, electromagnetics, and the list goes on. So we had a really good group. And I got to say that, and I was brought on with the electromagnetics part. That's my background. And as was pointed out earlier, I was a chair of the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering. So that's how I got on the commission. And at the time that I got on, I didn't really realize the concerns about exposure to fields, to electromagnetic fields. It was only after I got on the commission and started reading and looking at background material and listening to experts in the field that I started to understand, this is a significant problem. What I found out is that every expert we brought in, and there were 9 experts, everyone except one of those experts talked about the pretty significant problems, the health risks associated with being exposed. The one exception was the person who was brought in by the telecommunications industry to speak with us. And he was the only paid expert that came in. So in fact, a number of things conclusions we could draw from that is one, yes, cell phone radiation is a risk, but also that the telecommunications industry doesn't seem to want to let people know about that risk. And so that's where we stand today. The commission made its final report, and it's readily available, and you could Google it and find it. New Hampshire Commission on 5G, and I should get you to it. And we had recommendations. The recommendations are basically, one, to get the word out, because a lot of people just don't know about the risks associated with the cell phone. We can talk more about that, because the good part is that there are things that can be done to minimize that risk. Mm-hmm. We also wanted to protect people in schools, kids in schools, because they are more vulnerable than adults. And definitely we want to get the word out about protecting small children, because they're exceptionally vulnerable. So the idea that you have a young child playing with a cell phone is just, it's a horrible idea. Please don't do that.
Mm-hmm. Now, we are, of course, surrounded by gadgets, and technology is all around us. The fact that the industry itself has kept a lid on a lot of this information explains to a large extent why people perhaps are not familiar with the issues. But by the same token, we are so dependent upon that technology that it almost is a case where we really don't want to believe that there is a problem.
Well said. Absolutely. And I don't want to believe it either. I really like my phone. But as I mentioned, there are things that you can do to protect yourself. And let's start off with the phone itself. It's a strong transmitter, and it goes between 600 milliwatts and 3 watts of power. And it's a lot of power. And so if you're going to hold it near your head, hold it away. Or the best solution is to have it either use the speakerphone or a wired headset. Because if you use the wireless headsets that are Bluetooth, and a lot of people aren't going to want to hear this, but you shouldn't use the wireless headphones because you have a transmitter inside the headphones themselves and they're right next to your body. So the other things you can do is like turn off your Wi-Fi at night. In fact, this is another point that I should mention, and that is that the exposure to electromagnetic fields has been associated with a lot of things that's going to sound familiar to you, and that is insomnia, other sleep disorders, irritability, and of course that describes a lot of things can cause that. But if you experience things like that, you might try, turning off your Wi-Fi at night, and definitely turn your phone on airplane mode at night. Now, I've suggested this to people in the past, and some people have gotten back to me and they said, hey, it worked like magic. Turned off all the sources of radiation in my home, and I slept like a baby. Now, maybe it was psychological, who knows? But what I just said is very much supported by the research. Mm-hmm. And if I could display slides, I would be showing you what that research looked like. But I'll only say now that a work by Martin Pall, Pall, it goes into great depth about the psychological impact of being exposed to electromagnetic radiation, and it is significant.
Now, in terms of that exposure to that radiation, beyond our phones, beyond Wi-Fi, where are some of the other dangers lurking in our homes and in our workplaces?
Well, one thing is smart meters. Do you have those in Canada?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
These are pretty powerful devices, typically around 1 watt of power. That's a lot. And they're pretty much communicating continuously. So if you have them in your home, that could be a huge source. Now, here in the United States, we're working on bills to allow people to opt out of smart metering. I don't know what's going on in Canada, but I suspect that you guys are usually ahead of us in that arena, giving people more freedom. But if you have the option of not having a smart meter, I highly recommend that you take that. So that's one, smart meters. Another thing you wouldn't think about, you'd think are pretty innocuous, are baby monitors. They too are transmitting digital information, and they're near your baby, of course. And as I mentioned before, young children are very susceptible. Their skulls are thinner. So you're getting a lot more of that radiation inside their skull. And so there have been studies on children, and they're not good when those kids have been exposed. So try to minimize that.
You're listening to KW Magazine, 98.5 CKWR. Our guest is Dr. Kent Chamberlain. He is a professor and chair emeritus at the University of New Hampshire in their Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering. When you and I were talking off air, you indicated that very often you're not the bearer of good news because a lot of this information, as we mentioned, people don't want to hear. It's not good information. Nonetheless, there are a number of things, as you alluded to just a little bit ago, that people can do to minimize that, whether it's turning things off, whether it's keeping the phone away. Now, the fact that the information is not being communicated, the results of a lot of these studies are not being communicated to the general public. That clearly is a concern. Where are some of those obstacles coming from?
Well, they are coming from the Federal Communications Commission. And the reason that's particularly significant is that the FCC, a lot of other countries rely on what the FCC says in this country. I will say that Canadian standards, your threshold for radiation exposure is about half of what it is in the United States. But still, that's 1 million times or 1 billion times higher than is necessary for a good, robust phone call. So what's happening is that the industry is keeping the word from coming out. And the way they've done this is by capturing the Federal Communications Commission. Now, if you'd like to know more about that, there's a wonderful article written by Harvard, Harvard University. Their ethics department wrote a report that talks about how the FCC has been captured. So if you would like to read that report, simply Google the terms Harvard, FCC, and captured, and it'll bring you right to the report. So that's what's happened, and it's been in place for many years. So the telecommunications industry has a budget, a lobbying and budget, and for it's like close to $90 million. So they've got lots and lots of money to throw at keeping things the way they are. And by the way, the way they are is the same way as it was in 1996. When you think about it, a lot has changed in the electromagnetics landscape since then. I mean, I didn't have a cell phone in 1996. And so the whole atmosphere, the electromagnetics exposure that you get now is so terribly different that the rules that were set in 1996 just don't apply.
Why, given the technology advancements that we have on a regular basis in other industries, why are we not able to come up with a cell phone that is reasonably safe, or minimize the impact of Wi-Fi? Why have we not been able to do that?
Because the cell phone company, the telecommunications industry, does not want to recognize any harm at all. I give these talks since being on the commission because I feel like it's my duty. That was one of the things we were supposed to do with the commission, is get the word out. And so I've given this presentation, or given the same information on many different venues. And I've heard the FCC or the telecommunications people give their view. And they don't even acknowledge the body of evidence that suggests there is harm. They simply say there is no harm whatsoever. And they ignore the science completely. And of course, because of confirmational bias, a lot of people want to believe that. It makes their life easier. And so they tend to do just that. John, there's a lot of money wrapped up in this, as you can imagine. Even for a company with a profit margin of 17%, they seem to want more. And so here is one reason that they don't want to acknowledge a risk, is that the easiest way for them to get coverage in a particular area is to go where they want to provide coverage. They want to go to the center of that region where you have a lot of people generally. And then they want to put up an antenna and turn up the volume, turn up the power that they're radiating until they get coverage on the outskirts of their coverage area. Now, that would be a fine business model. It would be very efficient if cell phone radiation didn't harm people. But what ends up happening is that the people who are near the tower get millions of times more radiation than is necessary for a phone call, whereas people on the outskirts are getting good reception, and a reasonable amount of radiation that won't harm them. So if that's your business model, the cheapest way to put in a facility is to go in the center of an area and just blast the people in that area. You're going to want to have the standards where they are very high. Now, let me give you some numbers. And that is the standard in the United States, which is about twice what it is in Canada, is 6 watts per meter squared. That's just is a way of measuring radiation. To receive a good phone call, you need nanowatts. That's 10 to the minus ninth, a billionth of a watt per meter squared to receive a good signal. So for them to, or the other way that they could provide that same coverage would be to go out of town, put up a tall tower, and then beam the information down, or the signal, from afar. And that way everybody would get adequate reception and nobody would get blasted. But the cost to locate towers away from town means they have to put in access, they have to put in power, and it's just not something they want to do. So there are perhaps, when you look at the whole scheme of things, billions of dollars at stake if they acknowledge that there's a problem with exposure to fields. So they simply don't measure it. The report that I mentioned does compare big tobacco, what they did denying any risk to what's going on with cell phones. So it's the radiation is an issue, but if you could get to the point where you have towers located properly, there is technology that you can put in your phone to keep it from hurting you. And I can talk a little bit more about that later. Then we could get rid of a lot of these problems. But you have to acknowledge that a problem exists before you can resolve it. And I'm here to tell you that the problem exists, and I'd love to work on resolving it.
You're listening to KW Magazine, 98.5 CKWR. We're chatting with Dr. Kent Chamberlain from the University of New Hampshire in their Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering. And then, Doctor, there is the elephant in the room, G5.
Well, it's all the same thing. 5G is it's a marketing tool. There's no one established 5G, just as there really isn't an established 3G or 4G. So it is an add-on to 4G. And the problem here is that you're now going to be introducing higher frequencies. And the problem with those higher frequencies is that they don't propagate as efficiently as the lower frequency signals. And because of that, the telecommunications industry, wants to put in lots of these small cells. And I mean, very often, they're going to be putting them on telephone poles. I've heard that they want to have them separated by no more than 250 feet in populated areas. So that means that you're going to have these cells right close to you. And that is a big concern. And for the commission, we recognize that concern, but it's also a question of consent. Do you consent to have a tower right near your home? Maybe shining into your bedroom? I kind of doubt it. And I'm getting this reaction from people. Yeah, if I want 5G, if I have a business that depends upon it, that should be, great, bring it in. But if you're concerned about health, and a lot of people are, particularly as word is getting out that radiation is harmful, people are getting, I think, kind of up in arms. No, I want to be able to say no to having one of these small cells outside my bedroom window.
When it comes to the health, and you alluded to that a second ago, you said you mentioned that you had some members of that commission who were doctors. What are the known effects of the exposure to this radiation?
Okay, that's a show in and of itself. But let's start off with your immune system. It depresses your immune system. It lowers sperm count. And so, as you may know, that if you look at the sperm count in this country over time, it's been in decline. And an explanation for that is exposure to radiation, because where do men carry their cell phones? So that's just one, and this has been backed up in the labs. Everything that I'm talking about has been backed up in laboratories. If you have cancer, the likelihood that cancer will spread will increase as you get closer to cell towers. So that's another one. Your blood sugars go up if you're exposed, if you live closer to a cell tower. The list goes on and on. One of the biggest issues is reactive oxygen species, or which we know as free radicals, is that you get exposed to electromagnetic fields, those free radicals increase, which we know is tied to aging and other bad things. So, I mean, and when I give a presentation, I have examples of the peer-reviewed journals that describe the phenomenon that I'm talking about. So it's there, it's big. And the psychological things that I mentioned by Martin Paul earlier, it's all there, documented thoroughly. And also when I give these presentations, I send out links to every one of the articles that I talk about so people can read it on their own, make their own decision. I'm just reporting the facts, and I'm not here giving my opinion.
Mm-hmm. You alluded to the parallel with the tobacco companies and the tobacco industry. Eventually, the truth caught up with those companies. Are you confident and comfortable that the very same thing will eventually happen with the telecommunication companies?
Well, let's see. When was it? It was in the 1950s that we discovered the bad aspects of trans fats. I think it was like 2018 when they finally put in legislation to protect against it. So no, I think that things move very slowly, particularly when there's a financial incentive. So I think that people need to start protecting themselves. And one way is to just do the common sense things, go into airplane mode. If you put your phone on your body, hold it away from your head, turn off Wi-Fi, or yeah, just try to lessen your exposure. There's something else that is a kind of a movement going on, and that is wire your computer. And that is, don't use the Wi-Fi, simply plug it in and to your Ethernet, and you'll get much greater performance and you won't get any radiation. So that's another thing you can do.
It's a fascinating subject. Hopefully, the politicians, the FCC, will come to their senses, and some decisions will be made, because clearly the evidence is overwhelming that that this radiation is doing us harm.
Yes, it is. And more people are finding out about it. So perhaps things will move. And that's our next step, is to see what we can do in terms of coming up with legislation to make it easier for people to say no when a cell tower or these mini towers, these mini cells, are proposed near their homes.
Good of you to join us tonight. It's an interesting subject, and we appreciate your time.
I appreciate being here. Thank you.
Not at all. Dr. Ken Chamberlain, Professor and Chair Emeritus of the Department of Electrical and Computer Engineering at the University of New Hampshire. This is KW Magazine, 98.5 CKWR.